Yeah, we're a really unique organization in that we take a holistic approach to the environment, largely through work in these four areas: research, advocacy, conservation, and education. And these are just a few slides with some examples of some of the different work we have done in the different areas. And most of this stuff is on our website. You got to dig a little bit for it, but we have a really cool thing called the Cybrary, which is an electronic library, and some of it's in there. Some of these are headlined on the bottom of the homepage. This is a little bit old slide. It doesn't have PFAS on there. We've done a lot of work with PFAS around the former Brunswick Naval Air Station and around the watershed in general. So circulation study is very, very cool. You can go there, and we've got animations of how the water moves around the rivers and the bay here and stuff. We've been doing bald eagle aerial surveys longer than anybody in Maine, and kind of getting a late start here, but hope to get up in the air later this week. Start. And there's a few recent newsletters talking about how we do that work, and we coordinate with others that are climbing the trees and banding the chicks and getting blood samples for contaminants and stuff like that. So there's a sweet spot in time for when we do that. So it helps to know when the birds are on the nest, when they've had their chicks, and eyeballing from the air where the chicks are. Advocacy work, again, getting into a lot of the work we do is around migratory fish passage, and these are both gruesome examples of turbine mortality, hydroelectric dams. So we do a lot of work trying to stop that, and have been somewhat successful in the past. Big dam on the Androscoggin River in Brunswick. The first dam on the river is up for relicensing. It happens once in our lifetimes, basically, every 50 years or so. That's the time to make changes in fish passage. We have a Bay Day coming up where we have about 200 kids from fourth grade all around the bay out on the site doing hands-on environmental education, getting them away from their devices. Great day. It's wonderful when a little girl says, "I don't want to stop for lunch. I want to be an archaeologist." So, going to schools as well. And we've protected at this point probably over 1,500 acres of valuable wildlife habitat, about 13 miles of shoreline. Our focus is on habitat, not trails and so forth. So I mentioned we are recording this. So recordings live here on the home page. If you scroll down the right side under the education section, you'll see a link here for speaker series videos. And this is our season thus far, and our next and last program of this season here will be Indigenous Maritime Cultures in North America with Lincoln Paynes, historian. I believe Lincoln has maybe even presented with our speaker tonight.
Yes, we know each other.
Okay, so great. So, and I want to again thank Martin for doing the Zoom coordination stuff and doing our web work, and thank Charlotte for being here tonight. And also throw out a thanks to Harold Prince, who, when I was talking to him about some ideas for the series, had suggested that we have a spot on the lower Kennebec, I believe, maybe called Wild Horse Point. And that name, it's down in Pittsburgh, I think, that name may come from the subject of tonight's presentation, when horses were bred and also captured for this Caribbean trade. So tonight we have Dr. Charlotte Carrington-Farmer. She's a professor of history specializing in early American history. She received her PhD from the University of Cambridge in 2010 and has a very keen research interest in descent in the 17th century in New England. And she has a book, Roger Williams and His World, that talks about Roger Williams in his wider Atlantic context. And as a refresher for folks, Roger Williams was a 17th century Puritan minister theologian and the author, and he kind of got booted out of the Massachusetts Bay Colony and founded the colony of Rhode Island. And I think a lot of the differences revolved around separation of church and state. Um, our presenter is also has an active research interest in non-human animal history, specifically equine history. And her research looks at the breeding and export of horses from New England to the West Indies in the 18th century and its intersection with enslaved lives and labor. Carrington-Farmer has published extensively on the subject of equine history. Her chapter, Trading Horses in the 18th Century Rhode Island and the Atlantic World, entitled Equine Cultures, Horses, Human Society, and the Discourse of Modernity, 1700 to present, won the Association of College and Research Libraries Outstanding Academic Title Award in 2019. I have no idea what that award is about, Charlotte, or if that says anything about the content, but it's a great title, right? Well,
It's a great title.
it's a great title. So anyway, um, some of your most recent research in the field centers on mules, and you have a chapter, Shipping Mules in the 18th Century, uh, New England's equine exports to the West Indies, in the book Agents of Empires, Companies, Commerce, and Colonies, 1500 to 1800. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and let you have at it, and we'll go from there. And again, thank you very much for being here tonight.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here. Bear with me one second. Uh, all right. Okay, so I'm just going over here to start screen sharing.
We see your small slide.
Do you see my like main slide now?
No, not taking up the screen. No, now we're seeing your notes on the side.
Oh, okay. All right, let's try again. Uh,
Just have to remember what you did 15 minutes ago when we tried this.
That's all good as needed, yeah. Um, all right, let's have a look. All right. Are you see my screen
Oh, we're
still?
seeing your notes and the little slide, two slides. Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right. Well,
Awesome. So
not to worry. I don't really need the notes. It should be fine. All right, I'll try one more time and then if not, um, I will. How's
yep,
that?
there
Is
you
that
go.
is that
There
working?
you
Okay,
go.
great. All right, excellent. Thanks so much for having me tonight. It was great to learn a little bit more about your organization and to talk about this equine history that I've been working on for the last decade or so. Um, I want to start with a story this evening, if that's okay. And the story starts in 1732, specifically in July 1732, when Captain Crow set sail from Rhode Island, headed down to St. Christopher, in the West Indies, in the Caribbean, with a herd of sheep, along with 16 horses, all of which traveled on deck of the vessel. However, after about a month at sea, a gale hit and the sloop capsized off the coast of Bermuda. And although the horses on deck put up a really valiant struggle, they were rapidly carried out to sea and drowned. And Crow and his crew clung to the sloop and were in, quote, almost up to their middle in water for 36 hours before cutting away the mast, right in the vessel, and they continued for 19 days in this state, battling more gales and barely surviving. And the sources describe how they were in, quote, hazard of perishing when they met with divine providence, where Captain Remington, who was a fellow Rhode Islander, picked them up and delivered them to safety. And so Crew's sloop was one of the many New England vessels that braved the Atlantic, delivering horses to the sugar colonies in the West Indies, traveling down from New England. And the story I want to tell you tonight basically sets this in context, offering an important but overlooked interpretation of how horses were central to New England's trade and economy throughout the long 18th century. And you'll have to just excuse me a little bit. I'm a little bit croaky, so apologies for that ahead of time. So horses, I think, dominated every aspect of the early modern Atlantic world in a way that's almost inconceivable today, but they've completely been overlooked. And I think throughout the 18th century, horses were central to trade, labor, war, mobility, structures of power, and as the book I'm about to write argues, rival empire building. And I think it's really fair to say that this early modern Atlantic world was surrounded and dominated by equines in every way conceivable. And I want to focus tonight on the connections between New England and the West Indies. And I want to suggest to you that without without being able to understand how important horses were, not only to breeding patterns in New England, but also to export, excuse me, in the West Indies, we can't understand the well-known story of New England's role in rum, sugar, molasses, building supplies, and food stuff. I'm so sorry, just give me 1 second. And so, I'm so sorry. Um, so I want to suggest then that this book that I'm working on builds upon new work that highlights these commercial connections between New England and the West Indies. That I'm so sorry. That horse breeding was absolutely central to.
Take,
Um,
take a minute, take a minute.
yeah, thank you. I've been sick the whole week and I did not want to cancel on you. I'm so sorry. Um, so I want to kind of dispel one of the common myths that when people hear about this horse trade from New England, specifically Rhode Island and later Connecticut, down to the West Indies, is that they focus on the first type of horses that you see listed as number one, the riding horses, the Narragansett Pacers. And I'll talk a little bit more about them later, but Narragansett Pacers were the number one riding horse throughout the 18th century. And if people have heard of a type of horse from this time period, it's typically the Narragansett Pacers. But I want to also talk to you tonight about the draft horses that were also bred for export alongside of the riding horses and suggest that we can't lump all of the horses together. There were distinct markets for both the riding horses and the draft horses. And one of the things that my research really centers in on how important it is to understand the horse breeding in the context of both the markets for slavery and also sugar. And New England's landscape was naturally well suited to raising horses. You know, the region was perfectly poised geographically with pre-existing trading conditions. And while local markets around New England were significant to horse trading. The primary driver of horse breeding and trading throughout the 18th century was not the local markets, it was the sugar plantations down in the West Indies. And by the turn of the 18th century, horses were at the forefront of trading markets, which dominated the busy aquatic highway between New England and the West Indies. Now, down in the West Indies, horses were essential not only for riding, for travel, but also for fertilizing the fields. But perhaps most importantly, they were central as draft animals on the sugar plantations. The horses labored alongside enslaved peoples grinding sugar in the so-called horse mills. And planters in the West Indies did not want to waste valuable time and acreage breeding horses. And it made economic sense to import mature, work-ready animals from New England. So for New Englanders, obviously shipping equine cargo was a risky business, as we heard in the opening story, but a profitable one. New England's horse trade was part of this competing chain of supply and demand for animal labor, and rival empires fiercely guarded the horses that powered the sugar mills and profits. And later on, I'm going to talk to you about how New Englanders really did get into hot water with the mother country, with Britain, because they started to sell and send horses not to the British sugar colonies of Barbados and Jamaica, but to the French and particularly to the Dutch colony of Suriname. And this is one of the long kind of pieces in the road to revolution. And so New England vessels often flitted, sometimes illegally, between the French, the Dutch, and the English islands, trying to basically get the prices for their horses that were the highest. And horses were at the core of these imperial rivalries. And I think so much of this rests upon the fact that the sugar plantations in the West Indies could not survive or operate without the horses to grind the sugar on the mill. And the quote that you see at the bottom of the screen really gets into this. It says, quote, that the sugar plantations were in great need of drawing horses for the mills, without which a great quantity of sugar is likely to perish and be lost for want of grinding. So when you're making sugar, you need to be able to grind it in a timely manner, and you need the horses to be able to do that. So if you've not got a ready supply of horses because they've been sent to the French or the Dutch, this causes a real problem. And again, one of the other things that what I think is interesting about this project is my book is mainly on the 18th century, but the horse breeding goes way back to the 17th century. And when we think about the founding of New England in the 17th century, we often do it in isolation. But you can't understand the founding of New England in the 17th century without understanding what was simultaneously happening down in the Caribbean on the sugar plantation. So, obviously, Plymouth is founded in 1620 in New England. Massachusetts Bay is founded a decade later. But at that same time in 1627, Barbados came under British rule. So, using New England as a base to supply Barbados was part of that wider colonial enterprise from the get-go. And the first horses arrived into New England in 1629 when Francis Higginson brought 13 horses into Massachusetts. The following year, 60 more came. And by the 1640s, there was a targeted and expanded breeding program of horses. And by the 1650s, they are already talking about not only breeding horses to keep in New England, but to export them. And one of the probably the most valuable primary sources that I've looked at over the last decade is the Colonial Office files, the CO files, and state papers that are housed in the National Archives at Kew in London. And reading through those records by the 1640s, England is in a mess. We've got civil war, and there are petitions to try to send horses from New England because England is in too much of a mess with the war. And again, understanding how this expands as early as the 1650s and 1660s and the restrictions is central to thinking about the conflict that comes much later by the 1760s. So, whilst this is very much an 18th century story, that's when the horse breeding really does come into its own, there is a real deep 17th century origin. And I've got a couple of primary source quotes that I'd like to share with you. So, writing in 1660, Samuel Maverick said this. He says, quote, as far for the southern part of New England, it's incredible what's been done there in the year 1620 or thereabouts. There was not a horse, and now it's a wonder to see the great number of horses, many sent to Barbados and other Caribbean islands. Writing a couple of years later in 1672, John Hull observed, quote, if we procure a very good breed of large and fair mares and stallions, that no mongrel breed might come among them, we might have a very choice breed for coach horses, saddle and draft, in a few years might draw of considerable numbers and ship them for Barbados, Nevis, or other such parts of the Indies. And I think John Hull's quote is really interesting in that he's not obviously talking about just the export down to the Caribbean colonies, but he's identifying the different types of horses for specific jobs. The difference between riding horses, saddle horses, and draft horses, and what as well. And I was lucky enough a couple of years ago to receive a New England Regional Fellowship Consortium Award, and I was able to spend a lot of time in different archives around New England. And one of the most fruitful was in Connecticut, the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History. And I worked my way through the minor family papers as well as others. And what you can see on the screen is that as early as the mid 17th century, different towns in Connecticut were branding their horses with particular initials on their back end to stop different types of horses breeding. So they could do that targeted plan that we just heard of riding horses specifically being bred, but also draft horses. So you can see then, the brand for New London was an L, for Norwich it was an N. And so again, it shows this targeted breeding of different types of horses as early as the 17th century. What you can see on the screen is not a primary source. This is actually a mural that's several feet wide. I mean, it fills a whole wall from top to bottom and across. And this mural was painted in 1939, and it hung in the Wakefield, Rhode Island post office for several decades. It's now been relocated to the South County History Museum here in Rhode Island. But it's a fascinating insight into the economy of Rhode Island, but also other parts of New England, namely Connecticut, at this moment in the 18th century. And so on the mural, you can see enslaved peoples here playing a pivotal role in not only raising the horses, but also, looking after the sheep, cultivating the cheese, and you can see that we can't understand this industry in New England without understanding how it was directly dependent upon enslaved peoples and along their plantations. A lot in South County and into Connecticut, enslaved peoples were the one who were raising and caring for the horses for the first 4 years of their life. And I think this mural does a great job of showing that. I think this mural is also a really interesting source because it shows very explicitly the two different types of horses that were bred in the region throughout the 18th century. So you can see this enslaver mounted on this riding horse. This clearly was a Narragansett pacer. And the enslaved man here is holding a Narragansett pacer, one of the finest riding horses in the 18th century that could cover long distances without getting tired. But you can also see in the middle the other type of horse that New Englanders were breeding for export, the heavy set draft horse that's a little bit bigger with heavy feathers. And so it again shows this detailed breeding that was there from the 17th century. And there's been new work by historians in the last decade to really tell the story of slavery in New England. For example, the work of Jared Hardesty, Wendy Warren, Joanne Pope Mellish, to name a few. And there's been some great public history works, both in all of the New England states, that really do push back against this narrative that slavery was a Southern problem and shows how integral enslaved peoples were to the region. And you can see here this advert from the Newport Mercury newspaper, a valuable quote, direct quote, Negro man who understands all sorts of husbandry business, so animal husbandry. And so the newspapers are peppered with adverts like this of enslaved peoples who were trained to breed and care for specific animals. So, as I mentioned, there are two specific types of horses that were bred in New England throughout the 18th century. And the first and perhaps most famous are Narragansett Pacers. So, they first emerged in Rhode Island. At some point during the 17th century, and it's not really clear where this type of horse came from, and I can speculate a little bit more about them in the Q&A if people are interested. But these horses were typically chestnut or sorrel, as you would say. They often had white markings on both their leg and also their face. And they were quite small. They were typically what we would describe as a pony by today's standard. But what made them so special was how their backbone moved. So if you look at the image here, the front hoof is forward alongside the back hoof, and this is a pace. Normally, when a horse trots, the front hoof would be forward here, and then this back foot would be forward too. And so, with this unique gait, the backbone moves very straight, and they're able to cover incredibly long distances 40, 50, maybe even 60 miles a day without tiring themselves or their rider. Um, what's always interesting to me is that a lot of the primary sources describe them as being villainously ugly, which I think is often quite unfair. And the pacer was extinct by the end of the 19th century due to, in part, this export business, but also crossbreeding with other types of horses. So again, a couple of primary sources on the Narragansett Pacer. So you can see here an advert from the Connecticut Gazette from 1792, um, offering a Narragansett Pacer for breeding. It was described as the Peacock, the famous Narragansett pacing horse. And then it talks about what this horse looked like. So it says his size is good, his colour is bright chestnut, his courage and carriage none will exceed, and is supposed to be as good a saddle horse of that breed as ever was in America. So again, it gives you this sense of what this horse was like. And writing in 1753, the second primary source quote that you see on the top left, it describes how useful these horses were for long distance travel. So James McSparrow wrote, quote, "The horses were remarkable for fleetness and swift pacing. Some of them pace a mile in little more than 2 minutes and a good deal less than three. Upon the larger pacing horses, rode 50, nay 60 miles a day, even in New England where the roads are rough, stony, and uneven." And so there was a real market for this type of horse, not just in New England, but also in the West Indies. And horses were not really used in New England for draft work. They tended to use oxen due to the ground. And so for riding horses, there's a dual market in New England, but also in the West Indies. But for draft horses, it mainly is for export to to the sugar colonies. And the most important job that horses played down in the West Indies was turning the mills, crushing the cane. And this is described as a horse mill. So you can see that the horses basically go round and round in the circle, kind of grinding the sugar cane here. And you can see very clearly that this labor was directly tied to the labor of enslaved peoples down on the plantation. And as you heard earlier, timing was everything in sugar production. And if you didn't have a team of horses ready to go when your sugar could spoil. And an average estate in the Dutch colony of Suriname lost, I don't know, 50, maybe 60 horses a year due to overwork and disease. So there was a constant need to have mature work ready horses imported. And sugar planters down in South America and the Caribbean and the rest of the West Indies did not want to waste their valuable acreage where they could be growing sugar or coffee or whatever, breeding horses, because horses aren't ready to work until they're 4 years old. So you would be wasting your acreage on grazing for the horses and not have the horses ready to work until they're four. So, writing in 1740, the report from New England to the Board of Trade said this about New England. It says, quote, "The West Indies have likewise reaped great advantage from our trade by being supplied with lumber of all sorts by being supplied with lumber of all sorts suitable for building houses, sugar works, and making casts. Beef, pork, flour, and other provisions were daily carried to them, with horses to turn their mills and vessels for their own use. And our African trade often furnishes them with slaves for their plantations." So you can see here then the horse trade was not just this one-off thing, it was also part of this wider provisioning trade from New England down to the sugar colonies, and how it was tied to the trade in enslaved Africans. And so I spent quite a bit of time studying some of the numbers. You can see some of the manuscript sources from Massachusetts Historical Society, basically tracking the given number of cattle, horses, hogs, and sheep and poultry that were exported to the different colonies. And as early as 1680, Rhode Island's Governor Stanford said, quote, "The principal matters which are exported among us is horses and provisions." And as I said to you earlier, when the French and Dutch sugar colonies, particularly Martinique, but also more importantly, a little bit later, the Dutch colony of Suriname in South America, New England's exports go through the roof. And we know that by 1700, shipping increased sixfold, and the horses were sent to Jamaica, Barbados, Antigua, and Christopher, Montserrat, Suriname. And in 1 year alone, the Secretary of Customs in London recorded over 7,000 horses going just to the British West Indies alone, without the even more important trade down to the Dutch. And so Britain was furious with New Englanders for sending horses to their rival sugar colonies in the French islands and also the Dutch. Writing in 1714, William Cleland highlighted the problem of how New England was causing such a problem for the wider British Empire. And he said, quote, "Some inspections may be necessary into the trade from New England to Suriname, the Dutch colony. To the last they send horses by which they carry on their sugar making, which promotes that Dutch colony in that manufacture. There's a law or order in Suriname that these northern vessels shall not be admitted to trade with them unless they bring such a number of horses." So New Englanders um, weren't permitted to trade with the Dutch unless they bought a specific number of horses into the colony. And I'll show you in the next slide. I spent some time earlier this year going through the records that are written in Dutch. I don't read Dutch, but I read German when I was younger, and Dutch and German are similar enough. Going through the archives that are held at the Hague in the Netherlands of how many horses are actually coming into the Dutch colony and where are these New England vessels going? And so many of them from Suriname are going on to Madeira. So it's a really fascinating piece of the puzzle. So, writing in 1732, a pamphlet called The British Empire in America said that the British sugar colonies, quote, "will soon be reduced to a condition too wretched to be named, and an end be put to the British Empire in America." And the author identified the sole reason as New England sending horses. That's how important this trade was to the French and Dutch. And they're basically saying if they stop sending horses down to the French and Dutch, the British Empire would thrive. So this got me really interested in like how many horses are they actually sending down to the Dutch? And so, as I say, I don't read Dutch, but thankfully a lot of the records are really readable, the handwriting's readable, and the records are excuse me, really formulaic. So you can see the entry I'm interested in here. So this is Wednesday, the 8th of December, 1745, and it says, translates as arrived Captain John Goddard with the bark, that's the type of vessel, the Hoopwell, from, this is an incredible spelling of Rhode Island, Roodeyland, so from Rhode Island. He brought with him 32 horses, but he lost two of them on the way, and he brought 30 horses in. And so I've been going through the governor's record for the last however many months and putting together this screenshot that you can see of just a couple of the entries of where the vessels are coming from, what type of vessel they are, where they then go, how many horses they're bringing, to get a real picture of how important this trade to Suriname was. Um, I've also been able to use newspapers as a primary source. And one of the things that has become clear is that this term Suriname horses was well known throughout 18th century New England. And Nicholas Brown and Company, who operated out of Providence, advertised specifically for, quote, shipping horses wanted. Nicholas Brown and Company want to buy immediately a few likely Suriname horses. So people knew what that was, that these were the generic draft horses that you would send down to Suriname in order to meet your quota. And I spent a bunch of time at the John Carter Brown Library at Brown University in Providence, going through the Brown family records, and the letters are peppered with references to Suriname horses. And when James Brown and his son Nicholas wrote to their like horse supplier Roland Robinson, who was based down in South County, this is what they wrote. And they wrote this first entry in the 1760s. He wrote, quote, I beg you would get me 10 or a dozen Suriname horses. I hope that you will not fail me, for I shall depend on you. I want some horses that are in good case, fit for shipping, that are worth between £7 and £14. Mares will do if they're in good case, but they must be between 3 and 8 years of age. And they repeatedly reference that they want all the horses to be under 14 hands. And so when you're measuring a horse, you're measuring from the bottom of the hoof to the withers, which is the shoulders, and 14 hands is 143 centimeters. So they're not big horses. And they wanted horses that were fat, free from lameness, with two good eyes and good teeth. And so in 1764 to 1765, Brown had purchased 255 horses to send to Suriname, and he'd used a mixture of money and goods. And he sent them down to Roland Robinson to keep them through the winter. But he found out that all the horses were going to die. And what had happened is they had basically played a trick on him, and you tell how old a horse is by looking at its teeth. And someone had basically manipulated the horse's teeth. And he was like, these are the oldest horses I've ever seen. I think they might even be 35, which is really old for a horse. And he's like, they're all going to die, and I want to be paid until they die. So this is not I'm a big animal lover. I'm a horse lover. But this is not a happy ever after story. There is so much death in this. And a lot of the horses did get sick. And so one of the things I've been able to do is spend some time at the International Museum of the Horse in Lexington, Kentucky, looking at horsemanship manuals and guides for farriers, looking at all of the different illnesses that affected horses. And you can see this image shows all the different illnesses basically labeled on the horse. So, colic is basically anything to do with the stomach. You could see that it's got stuff with, their knees being broken. And so I got to look at all these really great sources on like how did people care for the horses in the 18th century. And just circling back to the Brown family, from the John Carter Brown records, you could see then that the Brown family are purchasing horses. So you can see here that they're asking Isaac Tripp to purchase for them 40 horses that are in good case, fit for the Suriname market. And they're going to pay for these horses in rum, sugar, molasses, and, quote, one Negro girl. So we see this uncomfortable truth that horses and human property are interchangeable for people in the 18th century. Um, so the Brown family really focused on shipping horses to Suriname. And that wasn't the case for other merchants. So Godfrey Malbone, who was based in Newport, Rhode Island, shipped horses all around the Atlantic world. And Between 1729 and 38, he sent out 84 vessels carrying a total of 1,601 horses. He sent the most to Jamaica and 15 vessels to Barbados. His vessels left roughly once or twice a month, and on average, each vessel did 2 trips per year, and each voyage took around a month. We know the different types of vessels that Malbone used. He had a very strong preference for sloops. And again, I spent some time looking at how typical this is, and from what I've seen from other merchants and what I've seen from the records of the different types of vessels that come into places like Suriname, that tracks. I think Malbone is a really great example. Most of the vessels carried the sloops and the brigantines carried between 20 to 30 horses, and so the smaller vessels, the ships and whatnot, carried between 18 to 20. And for Malbone, the most horses that were shipped was 40 as they were sent to Suriname. And I've seen some of the bigger ones carry maybe up to 50 horses on some of the vessels. And one of the really interesting primary sources I've been able to look at is account books, which list the purchase price for the horse, the upkeep costs, the cost for the hay, the corn, the oats, the bran, the water holders, and the halters for the voyage. So we can see how much money merchants in New England were spending just to get the horse on the ship, and how much then they made in profit once the horses made it there. And this is a screenshot of Malbone's account book. So you can see that he's got the water holders listed here, the hay, the corn, the bran, and the oats, etc. And so, the price of keeping the horses. So, again, this is very much an animal history, but it's tied to this economic history too. So when horses crossed the Atlantic, they did not travel below deck, they traveled on deck. And I've not been able to find really hardly any real images of what those vessels look like, apart from this one, which my friend pointed out to me when I gave a talk at Mystic Seaport last year. And so this comes from Thomas Jeffries' print from the 1770s. And what I'm really interested in is honing in on this vessel here, because when I show you this blown up, you can see then this is pretty likely horses under here. So horses cross the Atlantic on deck in a temporary stable. They were typically 8 foot high with a roof awning, and on the top, and you don't see it on this image, but from other written accounts, that's where the food and water was stored. And so any time they hit bad weather, the account books often describe how the hay and the water would just go off the top. The horses were packed tightly and tied in parallel rows with their heads toward each other, standing for the duration of the voyage. And I spent a lot of time at Mystic Seaport on my research fellowship reading accounts of how the horses suffered with illness, drowning, and accidents. And I want to share just a couple of those account books with you. So, Captain Henry Bower's voyage from Connecticut to St. Kitts on the brig Gleaner describes some of the horrors that the horses faced, how the main deck filled with water, the horses began to give out. An hour later, most of the horses were unable to stand. On top of the awning, they tossed part of the awning and 15 bundles of hay, trying to ease the vessel. That failed. And then a hurricane came in, and nearly all of the horses fell and were described as being in a drowning condition. The starboard quarter was struck, more hay was thrown overboard. The logbook describes how the ocean made a fair breach on all sides. They lost the fowl, the pig, and only 18 out of the 43 horses survived. And crew cut up the dead ones and threw them overboard. And so this is the types of primary sources that I've been reading that describe basically day by day what's going on board with the vessels. And one of the things that's been really fascinating to me is to find out when horses died on ship, why people on board would often save either the tail or the hoof. And that was because the horses, like other cargo, were insured. And so, in order to claim your insurance claim, you say, look, I left with 30 horses, three of them died on the way. Here's the hoof of or the tail as proof that I'm not trying to commit insurance fraud. And one of the most fascinating primary sources is the marine insurance records that basically record the different prices and policies that people took out on the horses that they were shipping. And you can see the voyage on the screen is from Saybrook in Connecticut down to the Windward Isles with 26 cattle insured for usually 1,614 horses insured for 800. And so you would need the hoof or the tail to prove how many horses you'd lost on the way. Um, I've got two more slides and then I'll wrap up and take some questions. And so one of the things that is really interesting is to think about how equine breeding changed throughout the 18th century. And so I was working in the archives at Newport Historical Society, and I was really interested in this primary source. I was really interested in the connection between how enslaved peoples here that you can see were listed alongside the animals. And I was looking at this primary source, and I was really disappointed actually with the number of horses that they had on this particular plantation in Antigua. But I saw at the bottom that they had a mule listed. And I just, by chance was reading what was at the bottom and I could see that it was torn and it was missing. But what this bit at the bottom says here is basically, they're writing from Antigua back to Rhode Island and they're saying, I've heard that, that you've started to breed mules there. Can you maybe send us some mules over here? And this took me by surprise. My work was meant to be on horses. But as you heard in the opening introduction, I recently published a chapter looking at the turn in the late 18th century to actually breed mules. And so for those who don't know, mules are from a male donkey described as a jack and a female horse, and mules are generally sterile. So when you breed a mule, that's all you're going to get. You're not going to be able to breed from them again. And there's a real interest in New Englanders trying to start to breed mules because the people in many of the sugar colonies are looking to have mules because they are hardier, they tend to last longer. But it was really hard for New Englanders to get the male donkeys to start this breeding program. And so there's these accounts as early as the mid 18th century trying to import these male donkeys and start this mule breeding program. And there's these really fabulous adverts in newspapers describing some of the donkeys that have been bought in. The famous ass Ottoman lately arrived from Algiers, and you're talking about the pedigree of this particular donkey and how he's going to be such an asset. But the final point that I want to end with is um, one of the more problematic elements of my research as to how do we write a history where both people and animals are described as the same and are often described, as legal property, which they were. And so I'm trying to think really carefully about how we write about this, because it's clear that horses and slavery, we can't tell the story of New England's horse breeding for export without explicitly stating how at every turn it was connected to enslavement, but also the trade in enslaved peoples. As we heard earlier this evening, it was enslaved peoples who cared for the horses in New England. As we saw with the Brown family, horses were directly traded for sugar, rum, molasses, and enslaved peoples. If the horses made it down to the sugar colonies, they toiled in back-breaking conditions alongside enslaved peoples processing the sugar cane. And so we also know that horses were used to and used by enslavers to maintain structures of power. And so you can see this particular enslaver tried to capture two freedom seekers here. And so um, I think this is one of the really problematic things that as we think about telling this story, how do we acknowledge that this is not just a happy story of New England being the leading exporter of horses throughout the 18th century and not just tell the story about how horses are part of that long road to revolution, but to really also acknowledge how none of that would have been possible without the colonial system of enslavement, not just the trade in enslaved peoples, but the enslaved peoples here in New England and also down in the sugar colonies that worked alongside these horses in brutal conditions. So I'll pause there and I'll stop my screen share. I'll happily take some questions if anyone has any. I see there's a couple in the chat.
Yeah, I'll start off and ask you about and this was wonderful, Charlotte. I think I knew nothing about this really. I think it's probably the case for a lot of people. So it's really, really informative and really great presentations. Thank you. Um, why do you think the Pacers faded away? You mentioned, the trade stopped and they became extinct, but was there something negative about Pacers? Why did we morph into Morgans and other breeds?
Yeah, that's such a good question. So, a few years ago, I wrote an article for the Rhode Island History Journal called "The Rise and Fall of the Narragansett Pacer" that tried to answer that question. And I think there's a couple of reasons. I think one of it is the export. A lot of the horses, the Pacers, are exported. I think the other reason is that the Pacers are, as primary sources suggest, were not a beautiful horse, and as the 18th century progressed, people started to crossbreed Narragansett Pacers with other types of horses. And so that purebred strain died out. And the thing that made Pacers so useful, which was for riding, right, they were saddle horses, meant that they weren't that suitable for once roads became more common and carriages became more common, people started to crossbreed those horses. So they had a more versatile horse that would both go under saddle, but also maybe pull a carriage. And so I think that's also part of it that there's crossbreeding as more people are starting to use carriages. There's the export piece. And so I think they're the main two factors. I mean, never say never, right? Like the pacer, there is these accounts by the end of the 18th into the 19th century that people are lamenting the loss of the Narragansett pacer, and there's one sole pacer left. But as you say, this type of horse has impacted other types and later breeds of horses. And I'm always hopeful, right? You mentioned the wild horses in your part of the world up in Maine that will come across some, long lost descendant on one of the Caribbean islands that was, washed up to shore. And with the modern science and DNA testing, maybe we could trace that back. But I think they're the main two reasons as to why pacers, dwindle out as we hit the 19th century.
Did I hear you right saying that in one year, someone had a record of 7,000 horses being exported?
Yeah, and that's just down to the British sugar colonies. And what I've really found is that that's not the main trade, right? The main trade is this semi-illegal and at times fully illegal trade down to the Dutch and the French, because the British sugar colonies, particularly Barbados and Jamaica, they're not that reliant on animal powered mills. They tend to use windmills, and then animals as a backup. But the Dutch colony is almost 100% reliant on the animal driven mills. And so that is a massive business.
Well, reminds me that I mentioned Harold Prince in the beginning, suggesting the horses. Um, Harold's an anthropologist up here, and he is Dutch, and I'm sure he'd be happy to collaborate on a paper with
Yeah,
you.
that's
Yeah.
great. Yeah.
So I can put you in touch with each other. So someone's wondering, were these mills, could these mills have been the origin of the merry-go-round?
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe that's a great question. I'm not sure, but I can tell you the mills were not fun in that way as a merry-go-round. I mean, it was back-breaking labor for the horses and the enslaved peoples grinding this sugar, and time was of the essence. So, yeah, I don't know. That's a great question.
Do we have any idea of how long a horse could work during the day? Would the same horse work all day, or they switch them out?
No, they would tend to do like stints of several hours together, but the accounts from the sugar plantation are brutal. The horses are often just worked to death because they're so replaceable. There's literally hundreds of ships coming in with fresh supply of horses, and it was often cheaper to buy a new work ready fit horse than to spend the time and money, caring for the horses that you've got if once they got old and sick. So the horses would work, several hour shifts together, and then another team would come in. And, as I said, a plantation in Suriname lost between 50 and 60 horses a year. That gives you a sense of how hard and long these horses are working alongside the illness and disease that they invariably faced. If they were lucky enough, I suppose, to even make it across the Atlantic.
Vance was wondering if have there been any movies done about this or any fiction written about this?
Not there's been excuse me, sorry, there's been a little bit of fiction about Narragansett Pacers, but nothing really about the draft horses, and no films that I know about. No, I mean everyone's eyes this year are obviously on the 250th, and that's amazing. But I feel like in a way that this is part of that story, right? Because again, I didn't get into it tonight, but there's legislation throughout the 17 teens, 1730s, and into the 1760s, starting to try to limit New England shipping these horses to the Dutch and the French. And so it's part of that long road to revolution. So I can imagine that, I don't know, maybe in the future, when I write my book, maybe it'll be widely known. Who knows if they're going to make a movie about it? I would love that.
Mhm. Someone's asking, Daniel asking, can you say something more about Roland Robinson, ancestor of a later Roland who established Rokeby Farm in Ferrisburgh, Vermont? He was a Quaker and anti-slavery person, but aware of his Rhode Island enslaver forebears.
Yeah, sure. So, Roland Robinson was one of the people who was involved in breeding the horses. We've got, yeah, quite a bit of records about that, about the number of horses that he typically had, the breeding process, the cycles, the number of mares versus stallions. And again, I didn't get into it tonight, but what typically happened is horse breeders had a stallion that would stand at stud, and people would pay a fee to send their mare to the breeder. They could either do it by a single leap, so they would just put the mare to the stallion once and see what would happen, or they could pay to keep the mare with the stallion and just turn them free in a field for the season, so they'd have multiple chances to try and get the horse in foal. And so Robinson was, at the forefront of a lot of that horse breeding. I didn't get into this tonight because I didn't have time, but the mule breeding is not run that way. The mule breeding is mule breeders tend to spend a lot of money importing these male donkeys, and then will basically ask people to send their female horses to them. The female horses get pregnant, hopefully they send them away for 2 years, but the mule breeders then at 2 years old will want to buy the mule offspring back to send off to the West Indies. And so there's these really sophisticated breeding schemes that are different for different types of equines. And Roland Robinson is one of the key breeders, in the 18th century.
Okay.
Thank you for the comments about being sick. I know it sucks. I'm sorry I'm sick right now. Thank you for bearing with me as I was spluttering away. I appreciate it.
Yeah, so thank you. Um, I just happened to be reading a book by a woman who lives in Bodenham now, Jan de Blue, who wrote a book called Wind. and she was just talking about the horse latitudes. And it's
Oh,
name because I can't remember. Lincoln would probably know, but if particularly windy or more of the doldrum type areas, but basically ships getting stuck there and having to get rid of the horses and
yeah.
dumping them aboard. So this would have been probably before this trade began, probably in the way earlier days when the horses weren't of as much value as they were, a little bit later once the Caribbean trade started. But
Yeah, it's fascinating. So this whole project came about when I moved to Rhode Island 13 years ago to take this job at Roger Williams University, and I flew my own horse across the Atlantic from England to Rhode Island, and I remember thinking like this is kind of dangerous, but it wasn't, but it felt dangerous and expensive. And it genuinely is what prompted this project as to how did they move horses in the 17th and 18th century, right? They couldn't stick them on an aeroplane. What was it like? And I was originally interested in the importation of horses from Europe to New England. And as I got into that, I didn't know anything about this export down to the West Indies. I knew nothing of it, but the records led me there. But it was truly, yeah, moving my own horse across the Atlantic 13 years ago that prompted this particular research project.
so at this point in time, I imagine the horses that were coming over from the UK, I mean, there are already horses here from the Spanish, but they were on the other side of the continent.
Yeah, so there's accounts from New England that there's no horses when they're arriving in the 1620s and 1630s. Had there been horses here previously, that's a debate for another day. That's one of the big issues in the field. But certainly for when the settler colonists come in the 1620s and 30s and 40s, there's no horses. In my book on Roger Williams, he describes the Narragansett, whose homeland he settles here in Rhode Island, their interactions with horses and how they have to think of a word for horse. And the Narragansett word for horse is Nene Wyoming. So they're using the sound that horses make to form the first part of it, right? The Nene. So, yeah, there's a great book if you're interested on the Spanish Empire and horses called Feral Empire by a good friend of mine called Catherine Renton. It came out with Cambridge University Press last year, and she's done a great job of tracing that history.
And say again the name.
It's called Feral Empire,
Okay.
and the scholar is called Catherine Renton. It's a great book. And that traces that earlier Spanish world.
So I mean, I assume there were horses out in the west or southwest, but they just never the two connected with all the space between, right?
Yeah, I mean, again, my work is 17th century New England, so I can say when people arrive in here in the 1620s and 1630s,
Um,
their accounts say there's no horses. Indigenous culture keepers may have different views, and like that's awesome, and part of the scholarly literature. But the 17th century European horses, specifically for the region I'm centering on, say 1620, there's no horses there.
okay, great. Well, I don't see other questions here, so I think you
Yeah.
should have something warm to drink, some rum and some honey or something like that, hot rum.
I appreciate that. Yes, it sounds medicinal. And if people do have follow-up questions, I can people can Google me. I'm pretty easy to find. Charlotte Carrington-Farmer. I'll also put my email address in the chat. So if people want to follow up with emails, I'll happily send copies of stuff that way. But I appreciate your questions, and it's been great to connect with you all this evening.
We all
Harold,
hope.
may I ask a question?
Oh,
Oh, yeah.
Harold.
Yeah. Hello, Charlotte, if I may. I'm the Dutchman here, and so I could actually read
Oh, could you read your thoughts?
that you had there. I worked as a gaucho in Argentina many years ago, first in 1973 and then in 78. I was very interested in the horses there, and I also did a lot of horseback riding back in my homeland. You talked about the Narragansett Pacer, and I don't know where you're from originally. It's not from Rhode Island.
No, I'm originally from England, from Derbyshire.
Where?
From
Derbyshire?
Derbyshire, yeah.
I worked in Somerset for summers there, also on horseback.
Oh,
Uh,
nice.
yeah, so that's on the Exmoor, in
Oh,
Exmoor. Yeah, very great,
beautiful down there. Oh, what a
beautiful.
great place to be.
Um, but to the point of Suriname that was prominent in your talk. What's interesting, most people don't realize that most of these slave plantations were actually very bad enterprises. They were run
Yeah,
extremely badly. Many of them were Jewish refugees from Brazil.
yeah,
As you know, that leads to the whole Dutch Portuguese wars in Brazil in the mid 17th century. But if you look at the debts of these plantation owners, it was extraordinary. They perpetually had to be bailed out.
yeah,
So it was just bad business. And so often people think that these slave plantations were so profitable, and often they weren't because they were just badly run, badly managed.
yeah.
Um, so just last point here that Ed Friedman in the introduction mentioned that there's horse catch point here on the lower Kennebec. But what's interesting is what I've been interested in is the indigenous relationship to horses here in New England, in particular Maine. The Abenaki word for horse is ahas, which is actually AHASS. You see it in the early Jesuit missionary dictionaries.
Uh-huh.
And Penobscot Indians here in Maine were actually hunting horses, which had been left behind in the first Anglo-Wabanaki War of the 1670s, which is an extension of the King Philip War
Uh-huh.
in southern New England. And we
Uh-huh.
have a whole story about horses here and Indians trying to ride horses,
Yeah.
and a bunch of them did. And my last point that Ed was mentioning, I think earlier, about the horses out west of the Mississippi, but were actually some of the horsemen, indigenous horsemen that were driven out from New England and Pennsylvania and New York that ended up in the Ohio Valley and pressed on. In other words, the diffusion of the horse from the Spanish colonies in Mexico, that was one major source, but also a French source out of Canada, and the other one, of course, from here on the East Coast, but it was much less, of course, than the one from the South.
That's fascinating. Thank you for those comments. That was a really interesting perspective. All of the points. Thank you for sharing that.
Welcome.
Yeah.
And thank you for the I mean, if I have any Dutch translation questions, I have a good friend who's Dutch who's helped me with some of the translations, but it's always good to have fresh eyes on those sources. As I say, I'm not a Dutch speaker.
Great.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Hope to tell you next month when Lincoln is our speaker, and hope you feel better again, Charlotte. Okay.
Thank you so much. Have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye-bye. Okay. Leaving.